Validators, thank you for your love and support. I appreciate you all. Welcome to my channel. This is Aduba, and please subscribe. Where our brothers and sisters actually sold into slavery, because we rose up and read about the slave trade, which tells us that our brothers and sisters were sold into slavery. We heard the things that they claim were given to our forefathers in order to sell these our brothers and sisters out to them. But what if we find out that this same thing that we're told is not true? And these same people who took our brothers and sisters were the people who rolled these things in order to justify the reason to which they did what they did.
Africans sold their own into slavery. I hate this comment so much and get it so often, so let's talk about why that statement is both heinous and disingenuous. First, if you read, you'd know that African systems of servitude were fundamentally different from what Europeans created. In many African societies at the time, enslavement was temporary, often results of war, debt, or crime, and people could marry, own property, and even regain freedom. That is nothing like the racialized, hereditary, and dehumanizing system of chattel slavery that Europeans built, a system where black people were treated as livestock, bred for labor, and tortured into submission. And even if Africans were involved in the trade, ask yourself, if someone sold you a person, what would you do? Would you chain them, beat them, rape them, force them to give birth to children you'd also enslave? Because that's what European enslavers did. Not just once, but systematically, by law and for profit. If it were me, I wouldn't buy them or I'd free them. I'd refuse to participate in the destruction of a human soul. But European colonizers didn't just accept the trade, they amplified it, scaled it, and legitimized it with laws, religion, and pseudoscience. So no, saying Africans sold their own isn't a history lesson. It's a deflection. It shifts blame away from the architects of one of the most brutal systems of oppression ever created. When you use that line to downplay or excuse what white enslavers did, you're not being objective. You're defending white supremacy. Whether you realize it or not, you're repeating a narrative designed to absolve the people who built, profited from, and protected the system of chattel slavery for generations.
Let me clear up one of the most weaponized myths in history. You've all heard the line, Africans sold, Europeans weren't worse. But that argument collapses the moment you stop applying modern racial categories to a pre-colonial world that didn't think in racial terms. It's important to remember that Africa wasn't a monolith. It was a continent of individual nations, kingdoms, empires, and ethnic groups. This idea of black unity didn't exist because there was no black race in the European sense. People identified themselves as their individual specific ethnic group, the same way that Europeans identified themselves as Spanish, Portuguese. And there's a part that people never talk about. Some of these African kingdoms were the size of modern European nations, or even bigger. The Benin Kingdom rivaled medieval Portugal in territory and organization, and the Mali Empire spanned an area larger than Western Europe. So when two African states were at war, you're not talking about black people selling black people. You're talking about independent nations with different languages, different religions, different cultures engaged in warfare, the same way Europe was. It's no different from England versus France in the 100 Years' War. They killed each other, captured each other, sold prisoners, and no one today says Europeans sold Europeans, because you understand national difference in Europe. Africa deserves the same contextual respect. These are some of the historical facts. The Portuguese started the Atlantic slave trade through kidnapping. In the mid-1400s, the Portuguese raided Senegal and the Gambia, taking people by force. This wasn't trade. This was armed abduction. And number two, African resistance was constant. And it's the important part. Europe introduced something Africa had never seen before. They introduced racial-based, hereditary, hierarchical, industrial slavery designed to fuel a global capitalist system. This was not comparable to regional warfare. Number four, this idea of a black race was a European invention used to justify mass extraction and turn human beings into a permanent labor class. Africa didn't see itself that way. Europe created the category and used it to rewrite the story. Saying Africans sold Africans is like saying Europeans killed Europeans in World War I and World War II. It's technically true, but completely meaningless without acknowledging nationhood, scale, power, technology, and global structures, as well as historical context. Europe didn't enslave Africans because Africans sold each other. Europe enslaved Africans because of profit, racial ideology, and imperial expansion. Local conflicts didn't create the slave trade. European demand did. And that's something that we need to remember. Don't let anyone weaponize your history. African wars were not the cause of the transatlantic system. The system reshaped African wars. It turned prisoners of conflict, a universal historical norm, into global commodities on a scale that the world had never seen before. This was Europe's doing, not Africa's design. The Africans sold Africans argument is not history's deflection. Africa did not create the transatlantic slave trade. Europe industrialized it, racialized it, and built the modern world on it.
Also, didn't Africans sell their own people to America as slaves? Yes.
Oh, stop right there. Stop right there. How are you going to say that Africans sold their own people into slavery? For starters, where did Africans put the money they got from selling slaves? When you use a Rwanda genocide to prove the fact that Africans hated each other, this is why they used to sell each other. But what you don't understand is every single tribal war that was in Africa was organized, funded, and sparked off by the white colonizers. European colonizers made sure that in order for Africans to be governed and sold, they had to be divided on tribal lines. For that fact, the belligerents in Rwanda made sure they categorized people according to their own appearances. The Tutsis were the bosses, were the leaders, while the Hutus were the subordinates. So what they do is they go to the Tutsis and tell them, you are the kings. They go to the Tutsis and tell them, those guys are kings, you need to become kings. In fact, these videos, you can look them up. The belligerents started measuring Rwandese according to their nose. The appearance of the nose tells the tribe. And then they issue a card or an identification to prove that you belong to this tribe and you belong to this tribe. And once they divided these people successfully, they started telling this side, you are the kings. This side, you are the kings. These people started to hate each other. And the hate is still on up to this day. When these Africans started hating each other, it was easier for them to be ruled and governed. And if there was a way how they could be sold into slavery, it was super easy. How are you going to blame that on Africans? Now, I have watched so many videos from your page. You sound super intelligent. I don't understand how you become so uneducated in this era where you can almost find the information all over your phone. It is no secret that Europeans don't want to take responsibility for what they did. So what they do is they're playing a blame game by blaming Africans that they sold their own people. I want you to tell me which race took another race as slaves. I just want you to tell me which race was taken as slaves by black people. How are you going to say the misunderstandings between black people is the same as being taken as slaves by another race? So, for your education purposes, the Rwanda genocide of 1994 was a symptom for a disease that was bled in 1950 by the white colonizers, aka the belligerents. Now, I don't know so much history about African American. I've just read and I've seen African Americans saying that during slavery, there were two types of slaves: the house slaves and the field slaves. The field slaves were the rebellious ones, that's why they had to work so much, grind in the field. The house slaves were the ones who were pleasing their master. They're saying when the master was sick, all the slaves would say, we are sick. You sound like one of those people.
No, our forefathers did not willingly sell people to Europeans as slaves. But before you get into any foul-mouthed tirade with me, let me encapsulate the one-sided and stereotyped stories you have been told over the years. And for me to do so, let me try to use an illustration that you may understand. In the Disney movie The Lion King, Uncle Scar wants to become king. He leads his brother, King Mufasa, the real king, into a death trap. And he tells Simba, the heir to the throne, Mufasa's son, that it was Simba's fault that his father is dead. And he asks Simba to run away and never return. So he uses this lie to manipulate Simba and seize power for himself. Simba ran away, and the idea that he was responsible for the death of his father stuck in his head all his life. He never came back and fought. He didn't come back to fight for what belongs to him because he felt that guilt that he was responsible for the death of King Mufasa. And while he was in exile, Uncle Scar uses this same lie to manipulate his kingdom, and he took what belongs to Simba. Now tell me, does this story sound familiar? One of the most commonly held misconceptions about the transatlantic slave trade is that Africans willingly sold their own people to Europeans as slaves. However, this idea is completely false, and it has been used to justify the brutal and inhumane treatment of the African slaves, and it has been used for far too long to manipulate the African people that it was their fault that their brothers were sold into slavery. While it is true that some African kingdoms participated in the slave trade, it is important to understand that they didn't do so willingly. Now, European traders used various tactics, including violence, deception, manipulations to coerce these African leaders into selling their own people. And the notion that Africans were somehow complicit in the slave trade ignores the fact that they themselves were also victims of colonization and exploitation. This was a story just to discredit them. So why do you think the way you do? I can help you with that. It's simple. It is because the dominant narratives about the slave trade and its impact on Africa and its people has been largely and primarily shaped and written by Europeans just to suit their narratives. It is this same narrative that has been told to you for centuries, for years, so that you will have this feel of guilt. We have this feeling of guilt. You won't have to put all the blames on the Europeans. And to those of you Africans and non-Africans who always say, but slavery or slave trade already existed in pre-colonial Africa. Oh, like Africans already had slaves. They already captured people. They bought slaves. They sold slaves. Blah, blah, blah. Please spare me the sanctimony. Yes, some African kingdoms participated in slavery. But it is also important, and I don't know why you don't want to understand, that the issue of slavery in the African context is different from that of the Europeans. The concept of slave trade or slavery in Africa wasn't based on ethnicity and race. It is a known fact that those slaves in Africa, they were not dehumanized. They were not maltreated the way the transatlantic slaves were. Most of these slaves, some of these slaves, in some cases, they even rose to power. Some of them even became prominent people in the societies. They were protected. They had rights, unlike the transatlantic slaves. So the impact and extent of the African slavery differed gigantously from the transatlantic slave trade in terms of scale, organization, and most importantly, its impact on the African society till today. So it is and it will be disingenuous for anyone to try to compare the two. So please, as we continue to learn and understand the history of the slave trade, it is crucial that we reject the false notion that Africans were willing participants of the exploitation of its people. Please, let's work instead towards a more just and equitable world. Let's stop the self-blaming. It is false.
Because before they came into the continent, they claimed that we're having this slave trade among ourselves. But the notion of us selling ourselves before they came here isn't true. Because what I understand in my part of my tribe, if you are owing somebody, you go there to work, not as a slave, but as a laborer until you finish paying for all the debt that you owe. And that one you are not taking forcefully. And we need to understand that all these things that these people wrote concerning what happened during that time, the hunter will always tell the story to glorify himself if the lion is not the one telling the story. We never sold our brothers and sisters into slavery. And that is the notion we want to erase from our brothers and sisters, because these people are doing everything possible to make sure that whatever thing that they did to us, they get means and ways to justify everything that they did. We need to understand the games these people are playing on us, to the point that they are making even we those in the continent doubt our forefathers and see them to be people who never loved us because they took sugar, sardines, mirrors in order to sell our brothers and sisters. But it wasn't everybody who was even doing it, because Africa, we are not living as just one group of people. Just like we have the Germans, we have the Italians, we have the French. It's the same thing Africa, we are living here. But when they finish, they just box all of us together to make it look as if we are one people who are doing the same thing. We are tribes. And even the people who were in contact with them, the leaders or the chiefs, they force these people with manipulation. With what they are doing today is the same thing they were doing to our brothers, our forefathers those days. So we need to understand that these people will never be sincere to tell the whole world what actually happened. They know the truth, but in order for us not to come together, they have to make sure they write the story to please them because of what they are getting out of the continent. The moment you and I become one people to rise against what they are doing in the continent, they lose their power. And in order for them to continue to hold on to whatever they get, they need to create that division. They always thrive based on the division among us. And that is the reason to which we still live in the stories that were told to us by these same people. Yet we don't have our own stories being told to us. All the books the great leaders like Nkrumah, like Du Bois wrote, are we studying them in the schools? No, because they reveal the actual truth, the things that actually happen. And because they don't want you to know and they want us to continue to be buying into their narrative, they always make sure that we study their literature, which has nothing to do with us. And we need to understand that if anybody will be set free, it is you and I. That was the reason to which Bob Marley said we need to emancipate ourselves from mental slavery. So all these things that they said concerning us were not true. United we stand, divided we fall, and united we keep standing forever and ever. The greatest enemy of the African is mental slavery. So let's decolonize ourselves from mental slavery. Let's keep sharing to educate our brothers and sisters. Together we'll make Africa great for ourselves and the next generations that are going to come. So that's the latest around the world and in Africa.